interesting things. Excellent. I hope you didn't get the first bit. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Michelle Cain. I've met her in a roundabout way when I had some solar panels put on our house. And I remember when I first spoke to her on social media, I was very, very nervous because I was sending a climate scientist my blog on climate change. And I was very, very worried about this. And my wife thought I was being stupendously stupid to actually do such a thing. But I'm very pleased to say Michelle was ever so kind in giving her critique of what I actually wrote. So that endeared me straight away, but I'm really pleased to see her this evening. Dr. Michelle Cain is a lecturer in environmental analytics at Cranfield University, and I've watched her on YouTube, and I know she specializes in lots of things. The thing I listened to was about the impact of methane, which isn't talked about, although it was talked about at COP26. So she's going to cover a variety of issues, and we will have a Q&A at the end. But so I'm so pleased you're here, Michelle, and I'll let you carry on. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everybody. I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you all about, well, it's about my thoughts following COP26, but I'll include some climate science in there as well, because I'm a climate scientist, so I can't really help it. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen and just go through the talk. Like Lucy said before, if there's points of clarification, please feel free to add them in the chat. I'll try and keep half an eye on that, because I don't want to lose anyone just through accidentally using some jargon or something like this. Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. Right. Okay, so yeah, the talk I was asked to give was about sort of in the fallout from COP26. So that's the it's called the Conference of Parties. It's the 26th one, and it's Conference of Parties means it's the it's all the parties of the United Nations. So UNFCCC, what does that stand for? United Nations Framework for Climate Change, something like that. So it's a regular meeting. They have it usually every year, and the countries around the world all come together to negotiate. And so the famous one is the Paris COP, which led to the Paris Agreement. And the latest one was in Glasgow in November. So this photo here was taken from that, because I went to the COP in Glasgow, and I thought this was quite a nice summary that says we can do this if we act now. So that's kind of, if there's one thing to take home really, is that we really do need to act now if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. The headline goal which is to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees and make efforts towards 1.5, limiting to 1.5 degrees. So so before I go on to talk about my thoughts following COP26, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some climate science background, just some key points really that I think will give the relevant background to what I'm going to talk about later. So I'm sure most of you are very familiar with CO2, seeing as you're coming to a climate talk in the evening. But some of the key defining features of CO2 emissions, the key thing really is that it has a permanent impact on temperature. So once we emit some CO2, particularly from fossil fuel burning, we've added some CO2 into the atmosphere, and essentially the warming that causes stays there, not quite forever, but for a very long time. So we think of these CO2 emissions as permanent, really, the effects being permanent. So one thing that that leads to is that every emission of CO2 causes a certain amount of warming, and that's fairly linear. So every trillion tons of CO2 that's emitted raises the global mean temperature by roughly 0.4 degrees C. Now there's of course some uncertainty in our estimates, but the point is that every ton that we emit has an impact. So following from that, if we want to stop increasing the CO2 caused global warming, we need any emissions to be essentially balanced by active removals so that there's a net zero addition of CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's what we mean by net zero. And this picture of the bath is one way that is sometimes used to kind of describe CO2 in the atmosphere. So if we burn fossil fuels, we have emissions of CO2 which go into the atmosphere. So that's like turning on the tap. And then normally in the atmosphere, the removals are very tiny. They don't really do much to alleviate the CO2 that's building up in the atmosphere. So every year we get more and more CO2. And if we want to make the level of the bath to stop going up, we have to have enough removals that balance the emissions, or of course switch off the emissions. So what you want is that level of in the bath to stop going up. And if you want it to start going down again, if you want to reduce temperature, reduce global, the level of global warming, you then have the removals have to be greater than the emissions. So that's CO2, which is the dominant greenhouse gas and the dominant cause of global warming. But there are other greenhouse gases. And so I just want to say a word about some of these. Methane is the second most warming greenhouse gas at the moment. And nitrous oxide is another, the third most. The lifetime of these gases is very different from CO2. So methane has a lifetime of around a decade, nitrous oxide around a century. And so they're not quite the same as CO2 with the bathtub analogy. We don't need to have, so the removals already in the atmosphere, because their lifetimes are shorter, we already have substantial removals that go on naturally through chemical reactions in the atmosphere. So that means that we don't need net zero methane or net zero nitrous oxide necessarily, but we do need them to be declining. We do need the emissions to be declining, and reducing methane emissions rapidly does reduce the amount of warming we have from methane. And so I'll show you that in this next slide. So this is a slide which was put together following the last IPCC assessment report, AR6. So IPCC is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And last year, they published the first working group report, so the physical science report, or the sixth assessment report. So there's 5 that have come before, like after the last one was maybe about 7 years ago, or more than that, in fact, probably. So it's an assessment of all the climate science, basically. And this is one of the summary figures, which I thought was quite nice. It shows in the first panel, the total observed warming compared to the pre-industrial period. So we're already at more than 1 degree of global warming. And then I'll just skip over to this third plot, where the CO2 is the first bar. So the contribution from CO2 emissions is shown as the largest contributor towards global warming. And then methane is the second bar. Okay, so there we have about 0.5 degree of global warming, which is currently going on because of methane emissions. Now, the interesting thing here is that we can illustrate this idea of the lifetime by saying, what happens if you stopped all emissions just like that? And if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, that bar from CO2 would remain the same height. So this contribution to global warming from CO2 would remain the same for hundreds of years. But for methane, this bar would halve in about 20 or 30 years or so. So the contribution to global warming from methane will very rapidly start to go down if we stop emitting methane. And in fact, it will start going down if we just decline our methane emissions. So if we start reducing our methane emissions. So there are some key differences between these different greenhouse gases. But those are the two key gases, and CO2 being, because of its essentially permanent impact, the CO2 is absolutely critical to get to net zero if we want to stop global warming. So where have we got to at the moment? So this is a graph from the Global Carbon Project. Every year they put together their best estimates of CO2 emissions globally. And so this was one of the latest charts that they published. And so this is showing the fossil CO2 emissions globally, and you can see some key points in time marked, like the global financial crisis, which had a small blip, and then the pandemic, of course. But we seem to be recovering very strongly from that, which, you know, has these, it means that our CO2 emissions are also bouncing back. So we can see that we're quite far from net zero. You know, if this was to be to achieve net zero, these emissions will have to go down to as close to zero as we possibly can, and then any residual that we really can't eliminate would have to be removed through some kind of carbon dioxide removal process and then stored underground on a fairly long-term basis. So we can see we're quite far from this at the moment, from achieving net zero. So COP26, this was quite a, you know, I think it was quite well covered in the media. So, you know, a lot of people, it got brought home to quite a lot of people, being on home turf, really. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that happened at COP26, and then some thoughts following on from that. So this is Alok Sharma, who was the president of COP, and is still the president. So that was the conference was the start of the UK presidency. And one thing that they wanted to do, that he wanted to do at this conference, was to keep 1.5 alive. So that was the a bit of a slogan. So wanting to keep the hopes of being able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, keep that alive. But we can, so even he concluded that we can say with credibility that we've kept it alive, but its pulse is weak, and we'll only survive if we keep our promises and translate commitments into rapid action. And so I think that's, you know, if you're not an optimist, you might not think 1.5 degrees was alive, but, you know, I guess it is still within reach theoretically. It remains to be seen whether we actually put in place the actions to achieve that, which would be a very, very rapid action indeed. So I'm going to look at, I will talk about methane in a little bit, actually, because methane is treated slightly differently. But oops, I'm going the wrong way. I'll come on to that. So the 1.5 degree limit, how close are we to keeping that? Now, this is obviously a global goal. And so in the UNFCCC process, so in the UN process, countries submit what's called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And so, or pledges, sometimes they're referred to. So they state their pledges, and then we can work out, you know, what they mean and what they'll mean for the climate. And so this was produced. So based on these graphs and pictures that I'm showing are from the government's website. I think the analysis was done independently by a few different groups. And so this shows that in the time just after the Paris Agreement was signed, we were heading for something like, if you base it on the pledges that were made then, somewhere around 3 degrees of warming by the end of this century. Then there were pledges at the Glasgow conference, which brought us down to about 2.4 degrees by the end of the century, roughly. So that's a big improvement, but clearly nowhere near 1.5 degrees. If you also bring in some of the how should we say it, some of the not quite pledges, but promises for or ideas for net zero. So some countries have also got net zero further in the century, which isn't necessarily within the Glasgow pledges or the NDCs. So there are some more nebulous commitments further down the line. If you include those, you do get just about below 2 degrees, so about 1.8 degrees or so. And so you can see that if all the pledges are fulfilled, and if all, everything that has been said is fulfilled, we would probably be just about within the Paris Agreement goals of well below 2 degrees. If 1.8 counts as well below, that's, I'm not sure if it does or not. But we're not quite at the 1.5 degree. So we'd have to have more action than is even pledged now. And so I'll just talk a little bit about, so there's a few different, there's quite a lot of different areas that were discussed in Glasgow and in the Glasgow Climate Pact, as it was known. But because my work is on mitigation, which is cutting greenhouse gas emissions, I'll just talk about that mostly. And so I just highlighted some parts of this that I thought were quite key. So as part of the Glasgow Climate Pact, all agreed to revisit and strengthen their current emissions targets to 2030 in 2022. So that means that they, because it was shown that the targets didn't amount to really satisfying the Paris Agreement goals, countries were going to come back this year and strengthen their targets, their NDCs, so we can try and make a bit more progress. So this is kind of, so there's some wording in the Paris Agreement about a ratchet mechanism, the idea that we will increase ambition. And so this is, I think this is a reflection of that. So trying to increase ambition by coming back the next year, trying to do better. And so there was also an idea that countries agreed to hold an annual high-level event on the 2030 ambition. And I think this is really finally bringing together some action which recognises that we really need to have made significant progress before 2030 if we're going to meet any targets in 2030. It's not very long away now. So this is trying to sort of increase the ambition of countries' pledges. And then it says here that the Glasgow Climate Pact only keeps 1.5 degrees C in sight if countries take concerted and immediate action to deliver on their commitments. This means phasing down coal power, halting and reversing deforestation, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles, and reducing methane emissions. And so those are some of the key things that the government, Alok Sharma had for this COP. And it's, although it might seem like phasing down coal power might seem, not terribly strong, it's actually, I think, the UNFCCC, it's not normally, coal is not normally mentioned. I'm not sure if it's ever been mentioned in any official documents. So it really is, it is progress from where we have been before. Yeah, so although some people were maybe a little bit unhappy about not being strong enough, it is stronger than it has been in the past. So I think it's progress. So then one of the things that was just mentioned there in the mitigation piece was about methane. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about methane also because it's my area of research. So at the COP, the EU and the US made an announcement about a global methane pledge. And so I think about, off the top of my head, I think it was about 100 countries or so signed up to this pledge about cutting methane emissions by 30% by 2030. That was the pledge. And so this is quite new, really. We haven't really seen such talk about methane before. It's mostly more focused on CO2. So I think that is good progress. And so this there was a global methane assessment published last year as well, which I think fed into this global methane pledge. And so it was published by the United Nations Environment Programme and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, if you want to look it up. But these were some, I thought, some quite nice graphics from that document, whereby it's they actually identified ways that we could reduce methane emissions, which would be these different coloured bars, apart from the dark blue, are showing how much could be reduced by 2030. And so it's from agriculture, waste, fossil fuels. Actually, I'm not sure what additional, but that's quite small. Actually, no, it's not that small. I don't know what additional is actually. But there are different sources that could be cut. And as a result of that, they also modelled what would happen to the climate, to the temperature. And in these different lines in this graph are showing different regions of the world and how much the temperature would change if you implemented these methane cuts. And 0 is at the top, and so all these lines go down below 0, meaning that temperature would be reduced through these methane emissions cuts. And so that just, I thought that illustrated quite nicely that there's quite a rapid impact from cutting methane emissions. We can reduce temperature if you compare between, whether we cut methane or not. And this will help us while we're on the path to net zero CO2, because we could see before that we're quite a long way from zero CO2 emissions. And so every little helps really. And so we can actually do something in the meantime on methane, while the sort of slow fossil fuel juggernaut of fossil fuel burning sort of tries to grind to a halt. So I think the bottom line with methane really is that this is helpful as long as we're on our most ambitious path to cutting fossil fuel burning, fossil fuel emissions of CO2. Because on the flip side, if we do this, if we do the methane cuts, but we don't do the fossil fuel cuts, and we continue to emit CO2, the increases in temperature from CO2 would wipe out any benefits from methane. So after COP26, now what? So I just wanted to talk for a few minutes about the UK in particular. So this is a figure from the CCC, so the UK's Committee on Climate Change. They had a progress report to Parliament last year, and so this showing annual emissions of all greenhouse gases aggregated together from year 2000 up to the present day. And the bar chart is just showing the difference, between, so in the colours it's the change 2019 to 2020, and the diamond shapes are the average annual change between 2009 to 2019. Yeah, so the bars showing the change over the whole of the period. Just trying to look if it says if it's relative to if it's just in 1 year. I think it is just in 1 year, which yeah, it's quite hard to match the two up. But yeah, I think it's just, according to that, it's just the 1 year. So anyway, this first graph is probably the most useful to look at. You can see how different sectors are changing over time. Pretty much all of them, apart from F gases, which are refrigerant gases, which can be used for things like air conditioning, refrigeration, and heat pumps. The others are mostly all going down, and electricity supply in yellow, if you can see that, has gone down off a cliff because we switched away from coal burning. So we've made good progress, and that's to be applauded. But now we need to do more on the harder sectors that maybe haven't been showing so much progress so far. And so So just to note that our target, the UK target, which is in law, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's pretty much all the greenhouse gases, all the substantial ones. In 2030, they should be reduced by 68% at least compared to 1990 levels. And then they've also got a 2035 target, which is a 78% reduction on 1990 levels. So it's a quite ambitious target. And we know it's ambitious because we're not really on track to do it. So after COP26, for me, the obvious thing is to fill in these policy gaps where we have an ambition, but we haven't got policies to actually get us there. We can't just, we can't just coast along and expect to get there without strong policies. So I think each sector will need different policies. And another element is that fossil fuel subsidies should be reviewed. And that's something that the CCC said in their report, because, well, I'm not sure if it's because, but as well, the wording in the Glasgow Climate Pact did say about phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So that would need to be reviewed at least, and hopefully reduced or gotten rid of. So I think actually I've got the same text on the next page here. So just to go into a few specifics, I'm not going to talk about every single possible sector, but just as an example to show how complex this is. And I guess, it's the reason why we haven't got policies in place is because it's not easy, but we need to work on it. So we take the example of heating and buildings. So actually, if I go back, buildings are the orangey ready. So we have had decreases in this the emissions, but we need to do a lot more because that is coming on for being possibly the biggest emissions sector in the UK. And so one element of that is replacing gas boilers with heat pumps. So the government has announced a boiler upgrade scheme to give you £5,000 off of heat pumps. And there are aims for 600,000 heat pump installs a year for the next several years. And to put that number in context, only 47,000 were installed in houses in the last decade. So there was a blog from, this is from, I think it's UEA, University of East Anglia, that hosts this blog in this centre, where I got these numbers from. So that's, a very big skills gap, I think. If we've only been installing so few, we definitely don't have the skills to do it yet. So there is, there is some ideas for, there's a Green Jobs Task Force and a National Skills Fund, and these have been introduced by the government. I'm not sure what stage they're at, but they were definitely in the heat or building strategy. The question is it going to be enough? Because during the first early stages of the pandemic, there was a Green Homes grant, and it was very, very popular, a lot of demand for it, but it didn't really run very smoothly, and there was much more demand than supply, and so a lot of people were disappointed from that. So it's a really, it can be quite a difficult topic to get good policies in place, it seems, going by our track record in this country. So that will be a really key area, given the large chunk of emissions from homes. So yeah, so I think that's a really important area to work on. So I've just got the last few slides, which are really about some things that some other things that we need to do if we're going to be successful to try and make a success of our journey towards meeting our climate targets. One thing is to bring the public along with you, and so there's been public polling shows that there is strong support for climate action. I didn't pull out any numbers, but people are concerned about the climate and they do think it's a very important issue. But I think, in my opinion, we need to have policies that enable people to make decisions that support the environment, because they would choose, I think people would choose to do things that are more environmentally friendly, given feasible options. So I think the difficulty at the moment for people is that choices aren't really available. So public transport might be too expensive or too slow. Like for me to get, so I work at Cranfield University, I live in Bedford, it would probably take me 20 minutes to walk to the bus stop, and then it takes an hour on the bus or something like that, whereas it takes 20 minutes to drive the whole way there. So, just as a sort of an example, it's sometimes just really not possible to juggle everything and make the greener choices. And the same goes for things like active travel, which here in Bedford is, I have in the past used my bike around town, but it's not the greatest way to get around, I think, with all the cars. And this is a picture from Cambridge, where obviously there are a lot of bikes, and it is, I'm not saying it's perfect in Cambridge, but I think in the numbers of bikes mean that it's feels much more possible to cycle around. And then the example of green investments at home, if people can't afford the outlay to start with, that's that's a barrier. So so some other things that need to happen, really, I think, in terms of policies and actually getting the whole country to the targets that we have. We need support from the Treasury and for government decisions to be compatible with emissions reductions targets. And so it's probably that there needs to be processes internal to government that actually take this into account, because in some cases it might just be that following the process doesn't get you to make that correct decision, which I feel like the Cumbrian coal mine, which never seems to get cancelled, because whatever processes happen seem to uphold it because it creates jobs, despite it being clearly incompatible with emissions targets, because we can't have new, that studies have been published to show that we even if we don't, we can't be investing in brand new fossil fuel infrastructure if we want to keep to the 1.5 degrees. And so there's a similar story with the Cambo oil field, where there was, it was going ahead until there was a public backlash, and then suddenly Shell decided they didn't want to do it. And in the news recently, I read that Rishi Sunak was going to endorse new drilling for fossil fuels in the North Sea. And so these are decisions with government, and he seemed to be very supportive of this, which seems to be totally at odds with the climate targets. So really, I think, as a country, things need to get a bit more joined up, and particularly have the Treasury and funds behind environmentally friendly investments. So I think this is this might be my last slide. So one other really important element, which I think is actually really key, is local initiatives and delivery, because this has to, at every single level, there's opportunities and potential for working on, cracking the problem, which is not just, it's not a simple problem of stopping emissions. Every single activity really needs to be transformed. And so, of course, at the grassroots level and at the local level, things need to change so that they become more sustainable and consistent with a net zero future. And so I think organisations like this are really important. And actually, I don't know a great deal about this, so you guys probably know a lot more than me. But I think I just want to sort of finish by saying that this is a really, a really important part of the picture, and people do things, make decisions based on community a lot of the time. So when your neighbours are doing something, you know that there has been research showing that kind of there's a community effect where if some people get solar panels, it can spread along the street. Really, things happen by word of mouth. So I think this is a really important thing to remember, even when we're thinking about these global problems. Actually, it's very important to get the enthusiasm locally, because then that feeds upwards as well. Right, so I just wanted to finish then just by saying this was from the 1.5 degrees special report that the IPCC published, and really the summary of that report was every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. So with that, I just like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be really happy to take questions.
Shall I come in, Lucy? Right, so you're on mute. Michelle, thank you so much for that. That was half an hour and you covered so much information in there. That was absolutely brilliant. There's a couple of questions come up if I can find the chat. I'm just going to start off. Where did my chat go? Yes, there it is. I'm gonna ask, as I'm hosting, I can ask a couple of questions. That's my bonus. Just very quick ones. I'll just ask two questions. Do you think we've already reached tipping points in terms of tundra melting, etc.? In some ways, are we past the point of no return? And the other one is looking at the government's net zero strategy. The greenhouse gas removals by 2050 seems to do an awful lot of heavy lifting to account for the residual CO2 emissions from, and I'm looking at the table here, aviation and shipping and agriculture. How confident are you? And I know you haven't got a crystal ball, but how confident are you that the technology will be in place by 2050? Thank you.
Yeah.
And then I'll go through the other ones.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't know if that's too big a question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can give it a go. So in terms of tipping points, I don't think we are at any major tipping points now. Like if we stopped emitting today, obviously that's not realistic, but if we did, then I don't think we've exceeded any tipping points. And there was a recent study looking at what's termed the zero emissions commitment, which is basically what would happen if we just had zero emissions suddenly. And so that was obviously a modeling study, they can't do it in the real world, shows that actually you'd have relatively little committed warming. So it would, some of the models it was sort of hovering around zero. So if we stopped emissions, then temperature would probably stay roughly stable. For CO2, this is just for CO2. But of course, the models don't have every last thing in, but I don't think there's really any sign that we have crossed a tipping point with tundra. And it's actually quite a complex system. And so although it's going quite gradually at present, I guess it's at some point in the future, there may be some sort of bumps in the road where things start to happen a bit faster. But I don't think there's any, if we could stop emissions, then we would be okay. We wouldn't have already crossed, we haven't already sort of committed loads of warming. So I think a few years ago there was some thought of, have we got some committed warming that would still happen even if we stopped emissions? But the current thinking is that if we stopped emissions of CO2, no, we wouldn't continue warming afterwards. And actually, if we stopped emitting methane, we'd start to bring temperatures down rather rapidly, like I was saying. So yeah, so then the other question was, what was the other question?
It was how confident are you about greenhouse gas removal technology to remove an awful lot of CO2 emissions?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is yet to be proven, really. And we can't rely on offsetting everything. And I think the danger of thinking about offsetting and removals is that, you know, there's not enough. If there's a small finite amount of removals you can do, it can really only, you know, that could only be offsetting for those really, really hard to abate sectors. So I think, you know, we shouldn't rely on the potential for offsetting or removals in the future. Try and not rely on that and try and eliminate emissions as best we can. I suppose the other element is that in the modelling that the CCC do for the government, which does offset agricultural emissions, so they say you need CO2 removals to offset agricultural emissions so that you can achieve net zero. Doing so means that the temperature actually goes down over time. So this net zero that they define leads to declining temperature. So where they model the UK's contribution to global warming, it goes up to a peak and then it starts to go down again. So if you weren't able to do all that CO2 removal, you know, you could imagine a smaller chunk of CO2 removal and it would just be more, for example, stable temperatures. So I guess that's something that's not really, you know, I don't know if that's really well known, that net zero by this what the UK government is assuming will be a scenario for net zero actually is to temperatures going down. So, you know, you might be able to, you know, think about whether if we can't do the CO2 removals at that scale, maybe a little bit less would be possible and still acceptable. Yeah, so sorry, I've waffled on for a little bit there.
No, that's brilliant. Sorry for hogging the first two questions. I'm not going to ask any more, but I will go into the chat and take a couple. Chris Laptop, I'm presuming that's not the real surname, asks, are methane emissions included in the CO2 numbers as some kind of CO2 equivalent? I'm not sure if you answered that in
yeah, well, in some I'm trying to think which graphs I showed in the end. So sometimes, so where it's if it's CO2e and if it's all greenhouse gases, then yes, the methane would be included as a CO2 equivalent. But some of the graphs I showed, so the graph of global CO2 emissions was just CO2, the one that had the pandemic marked, so that was just CO2. But yeah, typically methane is sort of aggregated to combine with CO2 using a CO2 equivalent, which, you know, has its pros and cons. Really, it's not. Yeah, we don't. I could give a whole lecture on that.
I think I listened to that lecture actually. That's very interesting. Thank you. And Pip asked. Pip, do you want to ask it, or shall I ask it?
No, you go ahead. My connection dropped out, so I can't see any of my questions anymore.
Okay, no problem. I won't ask you to remember it. Okay, thanks, Pip. Pip asks, what would be the most important thing Bedford Council, or any other council actually, could do to support action on climate?
That's a really good question, actually, and not one that I've really thought specifically about, because also, I mean, the solution to climate change is a lot of different things. You know, I'm sure you've heard people saying, oh, this isn't a silver bullet, and some people even talk about silver buckshot instead, because and I think it's one reason why the climate challenge is so tricky, is because everything needs to happen, because there's not one, you know, well, the one major contributor is fossil fuel burning, but because it's in pretty much every single aspect of our society, it means you have to do many, many different things. And so I'm not sure what the one most productive thing would be, but I'm mostly quite personally, I'm not so keen on lots of cars and traffic in town centres. So I think having like worked in places like Oxford and Cambridge, where yes, there are buses and it's pretty smelly, and there are also a lot of bikes. I think active travel is a really important one because it's good for people, it's good for health, and it's good for air quality, and it's good for climate. So you get so many like wins, you know. So I think that's one area that could be, you know, could be quite a good one to focus on, and would also just makes town centres much more pleasant when there's less smelly vehicles around.
Absolutely. Colin asked, could you please say more about where methane emissions come from and what sources are most within our control to achieve reductions?
Yeah, so the methane emissions are fairly evenly split between fossil fuel, so things like gas and oil and coal extraction, and in all that you can get like methane leaks. So where we have, so the gas that we use in our houses, the pipelines and all that, there can be some leaks. So that's fossil methane. There's also agriculture. So methane is emitted from cattle and other ruminants, and also manures of all different animals, also rice cultivation, and also waste, so landfill sites, and and other kind of waste facilities. And we've actually done quite a lot in this country on waste. So the chart that showed waste has come down quite a lot. So we've done a pretty good job there. And the easiest ones are probably to fix leaks in fossil fuel infrastructure, because that stuff is just, you know, just coming out of a leaky facility and going into the atmosphere. And so that is relatively easy to stop, although I would also caveat that with the warming that you get from that methane is a lot less than what you get from actually burning the fossil fuels, and then, you know, then the CO2 is going into the atmosphere. So even better would be to stop the whole process of extracting and burning fossil fuels.
Thank you. Lucy, do you want to ask your question?
I had a couple of questions and I've lost them now. One of them was about, in terms of councils. So obviously waste, you know, you've said is a really big methane issue. And I wondered if nationally waste is being addressed by incineration in that respect. And that's obviously a whole sort of poison chalice in itself. In terms of councils, my question really, is there one thing, or what's the one single best thing that councils could be doing in terms of waste and methane, really?
Yeah, well, I mean, so methane is in a way quite a tricky one. So I mean, employing best practice in waste, where you minimize and use, like, capture any methane emissions, is something that can be done. I don't know how much, you know, if it's done to its full extent in Bedfordshire or not. So that could be one thing. If it isn't being done, it could be done. I mean, switching people from gas in their homes to heat pumps and electric cooking facilities, that would be another thing, actually, because you do get escape of methane when you're burning your hob and when you turn, you know, when you're cooking. And yeah, so I think that would be, you know, something to think about potentially.
Thank you. I'm just coming off mute. The next question is from, thank you for your contribution, David. I know it wasn't a question, but it was very interesting. Jane, the Advertising Standards Authority today acted to censure greenwashing by some of the larger companies, which I seem to see a lot on my Twitter feed. Do you think it's worth us blowing the whistle more on misleading adverts?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think, you know, if companies are greenwashing to try and sell more product when they're not really, you know, when they're not being entirely truthful, then, I mean, there's a value judgment on whether it's worth it, and depends what else you'd be doing with your time. I suppose, it is a worthwhile endeavor, I think, for somebody to do, but there may be other things that are better to spend time on. I don't, it is, if consumers are trying to make decisions in their home life, obviously everyone's trying to jump on the bandwagon to capitalize on that kind of consumer pound. So I think it probably is, the right thing to do for somebody to make sure that they're not getting away with too much, like too many misleading claims. Yeah.
That sounds good to me. Mervyn, thanks you for a great talk, and we all do. And Mervyn's question is about the Drax burning vast quantities of wood chips to make electricity, and asks, how do Drax get away with calling its operation zero carbon?
Yeah, well, so there's various rules on accounting, and so I guess by some standard rules it can count as zero carbon, I assume, because the CO2 has been captured by the trees recently. So the trees have pulled the CO2 out of the atmosphere, then they burn the trees, or the pellets or whatever it is, and the CO2 goes back. So although there's a CO2 emission, it's a new emission, it's not a fossil emission, and so it's not adding, if you look at the life cycle of growing the tree to burning the pellets, it's not adding more CO2 to the atmosphere. And so I think that's how, although I'm not 100% certain. Also, I think, just for information, I think somebody from Drax is on one of the climate change committees. I don't know which. They've got 2 committees. I think someone from Drax is on one of them. I guess it's better for the climate than burning coal.
Sorry, take myself off mute. Thank you for that. And what is your view on nuclear as a source of energy, in terms of it contributes to less CO2 emissions?
Yeah, it does. So I think, I'm sort of ambivalent towards nuclear, really. I think a recent study showed that even if you were to decide, okay, we want to do nuclear for our green electricity needs, green energy needs, it would just take too long to get to that point. So it's very slow and expensive. So that kind of, at the moment, renewables are much cheaper and quicker to deploy. So I guess it's not that I'm necessarily against it for any, massive reason. And I would certainly be, I think it's not a good idea to close it down early, because then you have to fill that gap. So if you've got something up and running, then you might as well keep it going.
Thanks, Michelle. And sorry, that was Trisha's question. Sorry, Trisha, for not mentioning your name. The next question is, how do we avoid exporting UK emissions? Example, by reducing UK beef production and instead importing South American beef. And that's from, not sure what the first name is, but initial is A. Dolba. Yeah,
I guess that's one that really is for trade policy, or some kind of government policies to make sure that there's some people talk about like carbon adjustments if you have different carbon prices and things like this. So there are, I think, some policy mechanisms for trying to deal with that, but it is certainly it's certainly something to think about, because when you presumably trade is gonna happen where there's demand. So it is something that the clever policy people would have to figure out, so that you didn't have unintended consequences from, in this example, reducing UK beef production, and then we end up eating the same amount anyway through imports.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions here, because I can see more and more questions coming up. We're going to run out of time, and Lucy's going to be very cross with me. Francesca asks, your opinion, people are concerned, you're saying people are concerned about climate change. What data is that based on? And how many people do you think are actually happy to change their lifestyle? in order to help reduce it.
Yeah.
I know there's a bit of a there is a bit of controversy about that, and just following on from that, I'll just to get two in one go, about the greenwashing that's being done by London Luton Airport. And there is a question, actually it's a question for us, is that an issue that we should be raising with them as Bedfordshire Climate Change Forum?
Yeah, so I think, so the public opinion, so BEIS, so the government department for, what's it, business, I can't remember what it's, industrial, can't remember what it's, can't remember what it stands for, but anyway, BEIS.
Can't remember
they do polling of the public. I don't know how often it is, like every year or something like that, and it shows that there is, you know, the majority of people, I think it shows, can't remember the numbers exactly, but they have it published on the government website. You know, people are concerned, the majority of people are concerned about climate change. So I think, and there's been other polls as well, that I'm not sure if, trying to think if it was Climate Outreach or can't remember. There's some people who've done some work on this that I have read like reports on, what people are concerned. That doesn't necessarily translate to action, and I think typically, and that's kind of why I said that I think we need the kind of, we need to live in a society where we can make those decisions, because people are concerned. And I think the impression I get from reading these reports is that if there was an easy decision to be made, they would do that, make that decision, you know. So if you're choosing two different products and one is you know, the same price but is more environmentally friendly, a lot of people would go for the more environmentally friendly one. So I think having the capability to make these decisions without massive inconvenience to your daily life is really what's needed. And yeah, so if you wanted to look up the statistics, I would go to the the government web gov.uk, and you can search for like something like climate polling or something like this, and they do a regular survey, or maybe it's climate surveys. There was also a global one done last year before COP, which I can't remember who did that, but it was probably a UN organisation or something like this.
Thank you, Michelle. And a question from David about the trustworthiness of offsetting aviation emissions for net zero. Do you trust them, or do you think there needs to be more rigorous standards applied to that?
Yeah, I think there does need to be rigorous standards, and this sort of relates to the greenwashing. You know, not every kind of offsetting option is really equal. Like there are some that are better than others, and so Oxford. So there's a Oxford Net Zero, or an organisation who, so it's a kind of a project of Oxford University and possibly others as well. They've got some kind of ideas or principles for offsetting and net zero. So what do you need to make a legitimate carbon dioxide removal, basically? And so that's a good place to start, I think, because these things do need to be rigorous, because there's so much room for, well, greenwashing or temporary removals, you know, think removals that don't really last. And I think there is a bit of a question over what counts as an offset. If you're burning a fossil fuel and you're planting a tree to offset it, you know, that's not really like for like, and trees take a long time to grow, and they don't necessarily all survive. So, you know, in some ways you might think if there's a fossil fuel emission, it would make more sense to have permanent storage underground, for example, to offset it, rather than planting a tree, for example, which is a much more transient kind of store of carbon.
Thank you, Michelle. I think we're coming to the end of the questions with some brilliant answers. Thank you so much. One question is either a yes or a no, which is Is Michelle willing to share her slides? Understand if you can't, but if you can, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, that should be fine.
That's great. Okay, if you can send those to us, I'll make sure that they go out. And the other one was from Colin Hall, asking, are heat pumps really feasible for ordinary urban homes across the UK?
Well, I mean, I've got one, and I've got a 1960s house in Bedford. So yeah, I think they are actually. You know, a lot of Scandinavian countries use them through the winter, you know, and it's much colder there. So, you know, different houses might need a bit of work done, but that, you know, in some ways might just be that a lot of houses in this country are poorly insulated. So the insulation could be done whether you have the heat pump or not, and that would be a benefit, just full stop. But yeah, I think, you know, they broadly speaking are. It might not be for every single house, might not be possible for every single house.
There's a question about flats, actually. Are they suitable for flats?
Yeah, I mean,
what's better, ground heat pumps or air pumps?
I mean, I think air is more practical, because ground source heat pumps, you need to like dig a massive hole in the ground, so they're probably better for new builds. But I certainly think, you know, new builds should be, you know, I don't see why we've procrastinated so long on switching away from gas boilers in new builds, because you're just locking yourself into to gas, really. So we could have been doing this a long while ago, because a lot of countries have been doing it for years. So that, I mean, I think it's something that, I mean, I'm assuming the government are working very hard on, considering they've got these new policies coming through. So they're trying to presumably figure it out.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to, you'll probably never see me again. I'm going to hand over to Lucy to close. But excellent. I'd just like to say thank you very much. Over to you, Lucy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michelle, for a really interesting and engaging talk. And thank you, everyone, for really good comments and questions. There are just too many. And for Julian doing a great job on guiding us all through it. It was good to talk a bit about insulation at the end, because obviously with energy prices rocketing and fuel poverty massively on the agenda, that's really important, as well as heat pumps obviously going alongside that. One thing we've talked about at a recent committee meeting is also something that's come up briefly tonight, is carbon capture and storage, and how much reliance is potentially dangerously being put on that, and whether it can ever be a reality or dependable, affordable reality. So I wonder, we might come back to you, Michelle, and see if there's an expert at Cranfield who could come and talk to us about that. I don't know, if we were saying it's a bit unicorn the other day, but it would be good to try and investigate and get answers on it. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. So you'll find the recording of this brilliant talk shortly on our YouTube channel, and I'm just going to put that into the chat here. So it'll be there in a couple of days when I get around to doing that. Just another couple of things before we go. So our events are free, because we want them to be accessible to everybody. But if you would like to donate, every single penny is really appreciated. It helps us keep running our events and make sure that they're open to everybody. And obviously we can share them to get a wider audience as well via other means, by YouTube and Facebook and all of that. So I've just put the link in to that if anyone feels minded to do that. And also, finally, I must mention something that's happening next Wednesday. It's by another group next Wednesday at 7 p.m. It looks really interesting. It's also COP related, and it's a talk by a former Japanese ambassador who went to COP in Glasgow in the autumn. There's an Eventbrite link, which I'll paste into the chat in a minute. You can join in person there virtually, or it's in person, I should say, at Devington Village Hall, but you can also join online. So it makes it easier for people. 7 o'clock next Wednesday. It's also a fundraiser for Smart Homelessness Charity in Bedford. So it's, you know, although it would normally be free, they'd quite like people to donate if they can towards that. So I'll just super quickly put the link for that in the chat. If you could share it, it would be really wonderful. And I think it'd be really interesting as well. So Michelle's obviously coming from a sort of a science background, an academic background, but also it's interesting to hear personal input on things like policy and on her own home as well, that she's got a heat pump. But an ambassador who's got a different perspective, so it'll be perhaps more political and more sort of policy led. So I think it'd be quite complementary to this evening. So have a look at that. And apart from that, just to say thank you so much again to everyone, especially Michelle and Julian. Really appreciate you giving up your time. We don't have an event planned yet for March, but we have a couple of proper things in the pipeline. And we also have something hopefully in the pipeline to confirm too for April, which will be about nature restoration and climate change. Again, an expert from Cranfield who we hope to welcome back. So we'll let you know shortly about that. So keep an eye on the emails. And I think that's it. So thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.